In November of 1915, this is after the genocide begins, right, about 6 months, 7 months after, commentators became quite adamant in the press that this war was really a war of liberation. And I'd like to read you one more quote. Then this was November 1915, it was in the Fortnightly Review. Avowedly, one of the chief objects of the present war is to advantage small nationalities. In this war, Armenians are playing no unimportant part. So there was a real consciousness on the part of the public that the Armenian story, the massacre of Armenians, the civilian disaster happening in the Ottoman Empire, was part of war aims. It was something that we were fighting for. And that, I think, is a really important story of the Eastern Front that doesn't really get talked about very much. These claims that the West should protect oppressed minorities, even under the strain of war, unfortunately did very little to stop the massacres. A lot of it was rhetoric at home. In fact, by the time the war ends in 1918, well, that's on the Western Front, but by the time the war begins to end, 3/4 of the estimated 2 million Armenians living in the Ottoman Empire had been massacred or deported. So regardless of the sort of rhetoric and statement in 1915, not much really happens in terms of the Allies stopping the war. So the response, it happens on a different level. The story, I think, then, of the West's response to the Armenian genocide, rhetoric aside, is really largely one of failure. Like the Jewish Holocaust that would come just over 20 years later, knowledge of the massacres was not enough to stop the actual killing. And we can see this again and again in rhetoric or when folks talk about genocide, whether it's Rwanda, Bosnia, or the Holocaust, or even the Armenian case. Today I'm hoping to get to the question of why. Now before I move to the next bit, I want to talk about the main players. So how do we sort of set this up, this sort of weird response? On the one hand, you've got a public that's outraged. This is happening. Why is it happening? We need to fight a war to liberate. But at the same time, nothing is really done. To understand how we get this anemic response to actually stopping the genocide, I'd like to pause it. Do you have questions about the setup here? Yes?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure if you mentioned this, but what sparked the animosity that brought the intellectuals to Constantinople and Istanbul?
The question is, what happens on April 24th to bring those intellectuals together? There is a sense amongst the Ottoman elite that the Allies are going to launch something. And there's a real fear that the Ottoman government has in this group of Armenians. They fear that the Armenians are going to come over and help the Allies. There's a real paranoia that happens. It's, of course, ridiculous because the Armenians are unarmed. And there's a fear of a nationalist movement, which we're going to get to, that the Armenians are somehow the threat from within. And that worry is we're going to round these folks up, and we're going to keep our eye on them, and then the deportations begin. We'll talk about that. There's a sort of fear of an Armenian nationalism that emerges. Jay Winter talks a bit about this in his piece on Total War. Thank you. Good question. Anything else? No? Well, let's talk about the main players. First, we have the Ottoman Empire itself. The Ottoman Empire at this time was a vast territory spread over the entire Mediterranean with a largely Muslim population that also had a significant population of minorities who were largely Orthodox Christians. So we've got Assyrians, we've got Greeks, and the largest of that minority population is Armenians. There's also a small Jewish population. They are not targeted in the story. The Assyrians and the Greeks and the Armenians are targeted during the genocide, but the Jews are not targeted in this story. There is a Jewish population, though, a significant minority Jewish population also in this region. The great powers, as I'm talking about great powers, I'm sure you've discussed them before, of course, are Britain, France, Russia, and Austria. The first three are going to fight on the Allied side during World War I, with, of course, the help of the United States. The Armenians, the next group, their historic homeland has been the Mediterranean, that shaded region I showed you on the map. They are a Christian minority, and Christian minority, an Orthodox Christian minority, an Eastern Orthodox religion, which is something Greek Orthodox, Armenian Orthodox, Syrian Orthodox. They sort of share sort of common origins in an apostolic tradition. Largely, they were prosperous merchants in Istanbul or Constantinople, and farmers in in the provinces. This is important, this factor, this question about Armenians. Certainly Armenian nationalism is a factor, but this factor is also a problem. Armenians were a resented minority. They were prosperous, they were often bankers, they were often merchants. A story that we often hear when we talk about the Holocaust, the resentment of the Jews. A very similar thing is going on in Turkey during this time. There's an incredible resentment. Some people say that when those Armenian intellectuals are rounded up on April 24th, it is the perfect opportunity. The Ottoman Empire is taking advantage of what they want to get rid of their Armenian problem, as they put it, once and for all. Because this is a minority that is not Muslim, that is prosperous, and is resented as being this minority population in a majority Muslim country. Other minorities that I talked about, they are also important to the story. As I said, the Assyrians and the Greeks are the major group here. The Bulgarians will play into this as well. So the Ottoman Empire, as we're talking about it today, is massive. It goes, it's in Eastern, what we would consider Eastern Europe today. By World War I, it's more of a rump. but during this period, the Ottoman Empire is truly a great force to be reckoned with. I mean, they're the great empires: the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire. Of course, the British Empire as well. I mean, the world is organized in the 19th century in terms of empires, and the Ottoman Empire is an enormous player in this story. I'm going to take you way back to the Western response origins. We need to understand what the Eastern question is, I think, to get our arms around what this Western response entails. These players that I've just talked about, the European players, are concerned that the Ottoman Empire is going to crumble from within, and all this vast territory that they hold is going to be up for grabs. And so the great powers that we just talked about are vying for predominance in this region. They're sort of sitting there like hungry wolves, wanting to gobble up what possibly will be made of a disintegrating Ottoman Empire. It creates a series of rivalries in the 19th century, which means that these folks are watching the Ottoman Empire, certainly with greedy eyes, but they're very worried that if they don't intervene in Ottoman affairs, that someone else will. So they feel what I like to call a proprietorship over the Ottoman Empire, and they get very involved in internal Ottoman affairs early on, all the way back into you could say the Greek Wars of Independence in the 1820s, but the story I think really gets interesting in the 1850s with the Crimean War, which we'll talk about in a moment. There are two real issues when we talk about the Eastern question. There are geopolitical interests, like who literally gets the land, right? Who gets that great, Russia's always looking for a warm water port, we know, right? Does Russia get it? What does the British Empire get it? Who gets Mesopotamia? They're not really talking about oil at this time. But there's a real geopolitical and economic interest in the region. But there's also this question. The Eastern question is also about minority rights. It becomes part of the Eastern question in a real palpable way in the 19th century. Yes, it's about geopolitical interests, but it's also about defending the rights of oppressed minorities. Some historians say this is just a cover for geopolitical interests. They don't really care about these minorities. They really just want the Ottoman Empire. But I think we have to take seriously that the humanitarian interest, this idea that the British and the French in particular have a responsibility, and later the United States, to defend the rights of oppressed minorities in the Ottoman Empire is a motivating factor for the kinds of interventions that the European powers make in the Ottoman Empire in the mid-19th century. Well, let's talk about some of the conflicts, how this manifests. My first example is the Crimean War. The Crimean War is important for us because it's the moment when these great power rivalries come to bear in an actual conflict. The Crimean War happens on the Crimean Peninsula. It's kind of jutting out the Black Sea there. It's England and France and Turkey against Russia. The idea is we're going to band together so Russia doesn't get the best bits of Turkey. And the Korean War is fought. Turkey wins alongside with its allies England and France. And what that does is it gives England and France some power in deciding what's going on in the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century. They start calling the shots in a way. They say, look, it was our blood and treasure that let you beat the Russians, so now we have to have a say in what's going on here. The Tanzimat reforms were reforms that the Ottoman government had been working on, first in the 1830s, 1839, right after Greek independence, and 1856. And the idea of these reforms was the Ottoman government said, okay, we get